Welcome to Middlesex Moments from Middlesex Community College in Middletown. I'm Steve Minkler, the college CEO, actually speaking to you from my home as I record this edition of Middlesex Moments at a time when our main campus and all of our instructional sites are closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic that is sweeping across our community, our nation, and our world. Joining me today is a person who is no stranger to Middlesex Moments or to the world of online education, and that's Dr. Victor Triay, professor of history at the college. How are you, Victor?
I'm doing just fine here, working from home, and got all my on-ground courses online, and trying to get through it. It's been difficult, but doable. I had some advantages going in since I already taught online. I can't imagine what it's like for someone who's never taught online to all of a sudden have to do it. But so far, so good. I'm really impressed, not only with our campus, but teachers all around the country. Some of them, with a few days' notice, just switching everything to online has been really incredible.
Well, one of the things that I know about you is that you really are a great storyteller and you feed off the energy in a classroom. And it must be a lot different for you having to do this in the online space where you don't have that sea of students in front of you every day.
Oh, no. Well, yeah, that's kind of difficult. So I've been, in part driving my family crazy. So I sit there and tell them stories. And then, but they have the option of walking away from me, whereas my students don't. But yeah, I miss it. I'm just going in with the idea that this is temporary. This is just the second half of one semester, and in the fall we'll be back. And I do feed off the energy. When I'm in a classroom and the students are there, and there's just a lot of nonverbal energy. I mean, they'll raise their hands and ask questions, and I'm talking, but you could just feel it, this special vibe. And I've been doing this since I was 22 years old. And you know what? That has never changed. I have never once in the classroom teaching history been bored. When I hear other educators say, we've been teaching the same thing for 20 years. For me, it's like new every single time. It's almost like I'm able to put myself where the student is sitting and realizing this is all brand new stuff for them. It's incredible that I make a living doing this because I enjoy it so much. So, yeah, I miss it. I'm hopeful that in the fall everything will be back to normal.
Yeah, we all hope so. And I think, you, like many parents, have your kids at home, although your kids are college age and a little bit older.
Right. My youngest now is a senior in high school, and he goes to Xavier High School in Middletown. And they've been online since the start. My daughter, she's the middle child. She was a senior at Southern Connecticut State University. And, of course, they all got sent home. The dilemma that we're having with her is that she brought all her stuff. She had to empty out her dorm, right? And as a result, of course, we got all this stuff in the house, nowhere to put it. And then my older son, he is a graduate student at Central getting his master's in English. And you'll excuse the dog in the background. I warned you about that.
That's right.
I am home, so, we're all home, so I think all your listeners understand. But at any rate, so my older son is a graduate student at Central, and of course he's home, and so everybody's home, and it's costing a lot of money in groceries because they're all at an age where they eat a lot, and so we're serving 15 meals a day. It's like we're in the field with the army here, but it's good. It's nice to have them all home and all of that because we always had a lot of fun with our kids, and so we missed having them all home. So it's actually been pretty nice.
Oh, that's good.
And they don't fight nearly as much as they used to when they were little, so that's good too.
That's great. Well, like you, I'm working from home too. I've got a little makeshift studio here where I'm recording this, and actually in what was my daughter's old bedroom, and she is in New York City, waiting out this COVID-19 crisis. So far, feels okay, and she's sequestered herself in her apartment because she's not working right now. So that's, I suppose, one benefit of not working is she can just stay at home. So
right, and of course, New York City has become kind of the epicenter, at least for these weeks of it. So that's right. Yeah, so it's good that she's hunkered down at home.
So, Victor, it's time for a short break. So when we come back, more with Victor Triay and Steve Minkler, your host here on Middlesex Moments from Middlesex Community College.
At Middlesex Community College, we help students discover their future.
MxCC is our college.
With affordable payment options and easy access, come see how Middlesex can be your college.
MxCC is my college.
Classes in Middletown, Meriden, and online.
MxCC is our college.
Middlesex Community College, your future.
Welcome back to Middlesex Moments, coming to you from Middlesex Community College. I'm Steve Minkler, together with my guest, Dr. Victor Triay, who is a professor of history at Middlesex Community College. And we've been talking about the shift of the entire college from being on a campus, which is now shut down because of the COVID-19 world pandemic, when we are conducting all of our business and all of our classes online. You know, Victor, we were talking before the break about how you get a lot of energy being in a classroom with a group of people and creating this really interactive discussion. Do you think that students have a hard time with having to express all of their ideas solely in writing in an online class?
Yeah, but it's probably not a bad thing, because you never really stop developing as a writer. And when you're forced to do something, you get better at it. And you could see that throughout the semester sometimes. And, you know, at first they're just putting very little information. And even though I put in big red letters, you know, make sure to use detail and elaborate in your answers, a lot of them just don't. And then they get a bad grade. And then, you know, we get into an email chat. And I'll tell them, you have to elaborate more on the main points. You have to cover every point. And I tell the on-ground students the same thing with their essay questions. I tell them, don't assume that I'm assuming that you know something. I'll only know if you know something if you write it. And I told them, you know, one of the great advantages I think I have as a teacher is that I was a lousy student for much of my life. And I actually, you know, went to community college, and really what came out at the other end was a very different student to what went in. And then I went to graduate school, and I had to figure out a lot of stuff on my own. So I can relate to students here probably better than anywhere else. And I know, you know, when someone writes an essay, what they're assuming, but I tell them, you know, one of the things that I did is that I would imagine, you know, now just imagining that this professor wants to give me a 0. Mm-hmm. This professor thinks I don't know anything. So I'm going to prove to him or her that I know everything, right? And I would approach everything like that, and I ended up doing pretty well. So I try to encourage that as much as I could. But it's a challenge. I mean, I think at a school like ours, we have a great diversity of students. And by diversity, I mean where they are academically. Mm-hmm. And some are very, very, very developed, and others not quite so much. And you have to find that happy medium, whether it's online or on ground. It really doesn't make a difference.
Well, I'm talking with Dr. Victor Triay, who is a professor of history at Middlesex Community College. And Victor, you mentioned your own school days, and Victor grew up in Miami, Florida. And since actually your time as a doctoral student, you've become something of an international expert on the Cuban-American experience. And most recently, you released a book called The Mariel Boatlift, about a Cuban-American Journey. And walk our listeners a little bit through the context of what became the Mariel Boatlift in the early 1980s.
By 1980, you had a pretty solid Cuban exile community. And communist-era migration, which we refer to the people who migrated as exiles, not usually as immigrants. You had a first wave, which is when my parents and grandparents came, which was from the beginning until in 1959. Very few people came in 1959, and then in 1960 is really when it really picked up, and it went on until the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, and then it just ended. Just the door got slammed shut. Most of the people then came on commercial flights. They canceled commercial flights, and then everything was closed, and very few people were able to get out. And then in the mid-'60s, you have the start of the freedom flights, and then that went on for several years, very organized, very quiet, but very high volume. And then door got slammed shut, ended. And so for a decade before the Mariel Boatlift, you had a Cuban exile community mostly concentrated in South Florida, but in other places as well, not just in South Florida. And it was also the period to 1980 where you have what one scholar called the Cuban-American economic miracle, because by 1980, the community was very successful economically. And meanwhile, in Cuba, the complete opposite was happening. Cuba, the government there had hermetically sealed the island. People got very little to no information from the outside world. You understood the outside world however the government wanted you to understand it. People who had relatives in exile were very much discouraged from communicating with them, and it's something that could have actually gotten you into trouble. If you had relatives among the exiles, that was not seen as something good and could be used even to persecute you in some cases. And so people in Cuba were it ended up being very ignorant of everything that went on in the world. And then in the late 1970s, Fidel Castro decided to allow, he felt very confident in 1978, 79. He'd been made chairman of the non-aligned movement. They had 1 year of economic growth, which is probably the only one that they've ever had. And he was looking, for a change in foreign policy, and he decided to allow relatives in exile to go to Cuba to visit their relatives on the island. And about 100,000 of them went. Now, meanwhile, the Cuban people have been being told, all those people who left Cuba, they are on the margins of society. They're discriminated against. They've turned to prostitution. It's horrible. You guys are so lucky to be on the island and not having joined all those worms who've left. And of course, the complete opposite was the truth. But what did they know? By 1980, half the country had been born after the revolution. When you add those who were under 10 years old when they took over, it's a pretty high number.
Sure.
These people actually went, and it was absolute shock. I mean, they had never been around people that wealthy. And I mean, maybe the guy who owned a grocery store was the richest person they'd ever met before. And the freedom with which they lived, and they could travel, and they could worship, and they could say whatever they wanted. It was like this revelation. And at the same year those visits went on, the Cuban economy tanked. There was a blight on the tobacco crop. The price of sugar plummeted. And so there was economic desperation. And then for the first time in a long time, now that these people had an idea of the outside world and the freedom with which the rest of the world lives with, there was agitation, there was sabotage, there were people hijacking boats or stealing boats to get to the United States, because back then any Cuban who got to the United States was given immediate asylum, right? And Cubans aren't allowed to own boats. The reason is they'll use them to leave the country. And then finally, people started going into Latin American embassies, because there's all these deals between Latin American countries that if you feel you're going to be persecuted politically, you could take exile or ask for asylum at another Latin American embassy. And people started rushing, the Venezuelan embassy, the Peruvian embassy, just because they were accessible. And then the Cuban government actually started setting up guards outside. And so people started stealing trucks and just bursting through the gates. And finally, in early April, these two guys with several others commandeered a bus. I mean, there was an elaborate scheme where they got dressed up as bus drivers, the whole thing, and they burst through the gates of the Peruvian embassy, and the Cuban guards shot at them, and then one of the Cuban guards actually got killed by a stray bullet. And then the Peruvians gave them asylum, and then Castro figured out, I'm going to show these Peruvians a lesson. And he announced publicly that he was removing the guard from the Peruvian embassy, basically indicating anybody who wanted to go in could go in, right, to teach the Peruvians a lesson. And, of course, he was expecting 40, 50 people, and then, within 2 days, there were over 10,800 Cubans on the ground of the Peruvian embassy.
Wow.
And then it became a crisis, and I remember that in Miami, because there were protests in Miami. It was the first time, I was 13 years old, it was the first time I ever saw protests and marches and hunger strikes. And that 1 year I was going to school at a Jesuit school near downtown Miami at the end of Little Havana. And I took a public bus with a whole bunch of other guys who were at the school, and it would go right by where the protests were. It was incredible. And then finally, someone offered Castro an idea. Let the exiles, tell them they can come to Cuba and take away these 10,000 people from the embassy, most of whom had gone home already with a safe conduct pass. But the incentive will be, if you take the embassy asylum seekers, you can also take your relatives who are on the island. And a lot of them had just seen their relatives during those visits. And so that's how it all started. And, of course, when they actually got there, Castro wasn't just releasing the people who had been in the embassy and people's relatives in exile, but anybody and everybody was allowed to leave. And the United States government had no part in these decisions at all, zero. And so it got started, and when all this happened is when President Carter, almost the same day, launched his rescue mission of the American hostages in Tehran, right? So they weren't even paying attention to what was going on in South Florida. And by the time they did, there were thousands of people already here. And then the Cuban government would require the people going to Cuba on boats to take whoever the Cuban government said. It isn't like they had a choice. It's like you either do that or you don't leave. And so people were being forced to bring, whoever the Cuban government told them to bring. Yep. And then, of course, President Carter wasn't sure what to do, and they tried a million things, and nothing worked. And in May 1980, more Cubans came in May 1980 than in the whole of 1962, which was the record year before that.
Amazing.
And it wasn't until late May, early June that the U.S. finally started to put in certain, very effective measures to stop this. And plus, a lot of the Cubans in Miami were like, wait a second, you told us that we could go get our relatives. You didn't tell us we had to bring in all these other people. And so they got turned off. And then technically it didn't end until September. But really, by the end of May, by mid-June, 80-90% of the people who came on the Mariel Boatlift came during that period, including my wife, who got here on May 14th.
Right. So I think
her parents weren't allowed to leave.
Wow.
So she was 13, her brother was 11, and they left without their parents.
Wow, amazing story.
And of course, their parents were very persecuted when they were there, because anybody who said they were leaving Cuba, the government organized mobs against them. So there was a tremendous amount of government-organized mob violence against anyone who said they were leaving. And of course, my in-laws had the bad luck that not only were their kids and the aunt and uncle they sent them with, persecuted and put into a concentration camp, which they didn't know any of that was going to happen, but they had to stay in Cuba, already identified as enemies of the revolution. It might be my father-in-law lost his job, at his workplace when he went to get, the paper signed to be able to leave, which they didn't do, which is why he couldn't leave. I mean, they egged him and threw rocks at him and all of that. And then they had to live jobless in there, and, to the point that they even had to leave their home in the town they lived in to go to my father-in-law's grandfather's farm. He was still alive, and he had early dementia. And they pulled a mob action on them way out in that farm, to the point that my wife's great-grandfather thought there was a war going on, and he died 2 days later. So, I mean, you can say he got killed by the mob in Cuba.
Riveting story. And I think we do have to take a quick break. And when we come back, more with Dr. Victor Triay and his new book, The Mariel Boatlift, A Cuban-American Journey. And we'll ask Dr. Triay about some of the people whose stories he relates and throughout the course of this book, including his own wife, Amelia. You're listening to Middlesex Moments from Middlesex Community College.
I chose Middlesex Community College because of the location. Everyone's always willing to help, and they all just want you to succeed at the end of the day. Phlebotomy was my major, and what made me choose it was working in a group home and just seeing the pain that they went through. I highly recommend MxCC's continuing education program. This fast-paced course allowed me to get a phlebotomy job in a field that I love.
Welcome back to Middlesex Moments, coming to you from Middlesex Community College. This is Steve Minkler, together with my guest, Dr. Victor Triay, who is a professor of history at the college. And we've been talking about Victor's latest book, The Mariel Boatlift, A Cuban-American Journey. But he has a very personal connection with at least one of the people whose stories he relates in the book, and that is your wife.
That's right. Well, most of my books, the thing I love doing more than anything is interviewing people. And not only for my books, but as you know, I did that oral history project for Florida International University in 2016, 2017. We put together the largest collection in the world on Bay of Pigs interviews. And so I've always loved the interview part. And I always say my first interview was with my wife. And we were both at the University of Florida in Gainesville. We had mutual friends. It was a summer semester, and a bunch of us went to Crescent Beach for the weekend, which is just south of St. Augustine. And I really didn't know her. And then, we struck up a conversation. We both found ourselves in the apartment while everyone else was at the beach. We just started talking, and she told me her whole Mariel story. I was just captivated. I was like, wow, this is incredible. And she doesn't like talking about it. She wouldn't even give me an interview for the book, even though I cite her several times. There's a lot of incredible things about the Mariel Boatlift, and there's so many dimensions to it. But one that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know is what the people in Cuba went through. Cuba at that time was a completely, totally radicalized totalitarian society. where everyone was expected to have these very stringent ideals, this very stringent behavior. Everybody lived in a state of terror. Everyone was surveilled everywhere. When you were home, every block had a committee for the defense of the revolution, or every building, if it was an apartment building, whose job it was to keep an eye on the neighbors. At work, you had a dossier that didn't just measure your work performance, but rather your political attitude and all this stuff, which is why it drives me crazy. Every now and then I'll see a labor union in the United States or somewhere say nice things about, Cuba, and I'm like, are you kidding me? This is just incredible. And then at school you had a dossier that measured your political attitude, and if you went to church, it was marked. That's the type of society it was. Everybody was terrified about being accused of not being a revolutionary. It was like North Korea. And so when the Mariel Boatlift came about, Castro decided to respond to really what was a challenge to his rule, because you had all these people electing to leave, by radicalizing the rest of the island and to organize mobs in every town across the island to terrorize the people who were leaving. And the people who were in these mobs, most of them didn't want to be there, but you might have been at school, and you might have been in 6th grade, and the teacher says, okay, everybody line up outside. You didn't know where you were going. And by the time you got there, they'd hand you garbage to throw at somebody. And it's like, and if you didn't do it, you get in trouble, or you were at a workplace, it was the same thing. The United States has been a land of immigrants from day one, and every group has its story. But I don't know any parallel with this, where you live in a country that's not the United States. And the government of that country tells you, we're going to allow you to emigrate, which is incredible to begin with, that you should have to wait for your government to give you permission to emigrate. But let's put that aside for a second. Okay, we're going to let you emigrate. But from the time we find out that you seek to emigrate to the time you're on the high seas, we're going to make your life a nightmare. We're going to send mobs to your house. When you get on the bus, we're going to surround it with the mob. They're going to throw eggs at you. They're going to throw potatoes with razor blades in them at you.
Unbelievable.
Right? And then we're going to take you to, and then we're going to take you to this old former country club where there's going to be a mob outside where you have to go in for processing. And on your way in, that mob is going to hit you and throw stuff at you and insult you and humiliate you, even if you're 8 years old. And then once you're in there, we're going to keep you in there and starve you for a little while. And then we're going to send you to this desolate beachside camp. It was not a pretty beach. It was all rock, where it's basically a concentration camp. We're going to strip search you completely on your way in, and then we're going to put you in these tents, and we're going to give you half-rotten food for as long as we want. And there's going to be guards and barbed wire fences and attack dogs and all of that. And then when you actually go to the boat that's waiting for you, okay, if that boat, the capacity is 25. If the person came to pick up 4 relatives, right, we're going to find out what the capacity of that boat is. And they say, well, you're taking 4 relatives, but we're going to put 25 people on here. Or they'll ask them, what does this boat carry? Well, it carries 25, but I only came for 4. All right, carries 25, put 50 people on there. And the government, this is the government, okay, these are government officials massively overloading boats to where the water line was beneath the surface. And then they'd wait for bad weather and say, now you can go.
Oh, brother.
And you have to go. Right?
Wow.
And so the number of boats, my wife's boat sank. My wife was pulled out of the water by the U.S. Coast Guard, by the USS Diligence. Her boat was going down, and they threw out all the stuff on the boat, and another boat turned back, and then they actually sent the lifeboat down. They put her in it, her brother, and everyone else on their boat, and then hoisted it up on these ropes and got them to the deck of the ship. And then she actually got to Key West on a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, and she watched the boat she was on sinking. Now, can you imagine that? 13 years old, her brother's 11.
No.
They've just separated from their parents, and this happened all at once. It's like all of a sudden, she was home from school for lunch, and it's like, your uncle's at the port. We're leaving. And it's like, what? And then, everyone had to get their signatures from their workplaces. Like I said, they didn't let my in-laws leave. And they asked my wife, do you want to go? She said, yeah, I'm not going back out there with those mobs. And then they sat her in a room and her brother separately and said, these government officials grilling them alone, saying, are you sure you want to leave? You're never going to see your parents again. Do you realize that if you leave? And you're a traitor and this, that, and the other. This is a kid.
Yeah.
But my wife was more scared of the mobs outside, so she said, I'm leaving. And she finally left and separated. Fortunately, her parents got out later through Costa Rica, but she spent over a year not seeing her parents. She went straight to relatives she really didn't even know. Fortunately, those relatives were wonderful with her. And they was all because of the Cuban government. It didn't have to be that way. Even if people came on boats to pick them up, they wanted to terrorize anyone who was leaving. And it's something the Cuban government doesn't even talk about now because they can't twist that in any positive way. So they just pretend it doesn't happen.
So of the people that you interviewed for your book, the Mariel Boatlift, A Cuban-American Journey, are there one or two people who just jump out at you, whose stories were so compelling that it's almost like you...
Oh, my goodness, yeah. There was this, for instance, this one woman, never with the government, but didn't cause any problems. She was married. She had 3 children, two teenage boys and a daughter. And she got word from her relatives in Miami, hey, we've hired a boat to go get you. Be ready. It's going to be there in a few days. And, of course, they were thrilled. And, and then sure enough, word came to them. The soldier knocked at the door and said, there's a car here to take you to that country club that I mentioned for processing. And she said, great. And, of course, while they were leaving, they did what they were called acts of repudiation or acts of disdain. Mm-hmm. And there was a mob outside their house, and, of course, they got harassed by the mob. But they went to that country club, or, again, it was a country club until the 1950s. It was just a wrecked building at that point. And then they got there, they waited. And this happened a lot at this place because they would just toy with you and say, you 3 can leave, but you 2 can't. Well, then we're not going to leave. No, now you have to. And you have to separate. And what happened to this woman, she had one son who was 15, he was about to turn 16, and another boy who was 14, and a daughter who was 7. And it was the 3 kids, this woman and her husband. And they told them there, you can all leave, but the 15-year-old can't. It's like, well, why not? They said, well, because he's about to turn military age, and military age in Cuba was 16 to 27, and if you were in that range, you weren't allowed to leave. And it's like, well, what do we do? And then, of course, there was really no choice. Right, the father had to stay with the son. And the father said, listen, I'm not going to get a job now because we're already marked as enemies. So the 3 of you leave and I'll stay with the older son and we'll figure out a way to get out. But there's no way I could support the 5 of us. And plus you guys need to get out because the 14-year-old is going to be 15 next year. And we're going to be facing this with him. So the mother left with the 14-year-old and the 7-year-old daughter. And then the father stayed with the 15-year-old. And it's like, how do we get him out? How do we get out? And this is, probably a lot of people could tell a similar story to this, that you could get out of military service if you were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so he went to the library. He read all the symptoms of schizophrenia. He told his son, we're going to go to the doctor. This is what I want you to do. Right? So they went to the doctor, and the son pretended he had schizophrenia, the 15-year-old. And, of course, the father said, oh, doctor, I don't know what's wrong with him. He's been acting like this and like that. And, of course, the doctor said, oh, it sounds like schizophrenia. Maybe we should send him to the psychiatrist. And they went to and this kid was pretending all this time for 2 years.
Wow.
And then they finally put him in a mental hospital. The kid didn't have anything. And whatever medicines they gave him, they would just throw them away. And the father was with him for 3 days at the hospital. And then finally he said, they're going to get suspicious if I never leave here. So he called his sister, told her what was happening, to come stay with him. He was going to go home, take a shower, and come back. While he was away, the doctors came in to do electroshock therapy on him. And the kid freaked out, and when the doctors turned around, he jumped out the window of the first floor room and went home in his hospital gown.
Wow.
Right? And he told his dad, Dad, I can't do this anymore. And the dad said, all right, I'm not going to make you. But fortunately, they concluded that his condition was worse than they previously thought
Really?
because he had left the hospital. And so they confirmed the schizophrenia, whatever, and then he had to go before a military tribunal by himself, a tribunal of doctors from the military, and they had to examine him, and he acted his way through that. And after 2 years of doing this, they were finally able to leave the country through Venezuela.
Yeah. Well, Victor Triay, you are, again, an international expert in the Cuban-American experience and this period of history in the life of the country of Cuba and its change from what it was before the Castro regime and then throughout the entire Castro era. I'm pleased. I think our listeners need to know that this book that we've been talking about, the Mariel Boatlift, A Cuban-American Journey, has won the Philip and Dana Zimmerman Gold Medal in the 2019 Florida Book Awards for the nonfiction category. But we are
Yeah.
incredibly proud of you here at Middlesex Community College. I know your family
thank
is as
you.
well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I'd really like to thank you, Dr. Victor Triay, for joining me today. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us for another edition of Middlesex Moments. You can always visit us at Middlesex Community College in our temporary, fully online home at mxcc.edu. And hopefully in the near future as we reopen our main campus at 100 Training Hill Road in Middletown and our Meriden Center at Platt High School. So for everyone at Middlesex Community College, I'm Steve Minkler. Please be safe and be well.